So I think what we're going to do is try to have this conversation for the next hour, since nothing new has happened on Iran in the last couple of weeks that would provoke a dialogue. Although I do say that I'm sort of sick of debating the JCPOA, and I'm annoyed I have to do it again 2 years later. But here we are. So why don't we just go right to it and start with Liz. And Liz, I think before we can dive into all the what's and maybes and what will happen in the future, I mean, maybe we can just start with, the president made a big announcement a couple weeks ago. He chose to not certify to Congress that Iran was abiding by the nuclear agreement. What does that mean in practical terms, and what are the implications of where this goes from here, especially, in Congress? It's something I know you've been following very, very closely.
Right. Thanks, Ilan, and thanks very much to our sponsors. We might even say that it was just a couple of days ago. Weeks might even be a stretch. It's apropos of your comment. There's really
feels like weeks.
Right, exactly. There's been a lot going on. Yeah, I can set the stage on this. So, as some of you may know, the president faced an October 15th deadline to certify to Congress, and this is a requirement created by the U.S. Congress for the U.S. president, so it's just domestic, that Iran is in compliance with its nuclear obligations under the deal, that continuing in the deal is in the U.S. national interest, and furthermore that the sanctions relief provided to Iran is proportional and appropriate to the nuclear concessions that it's making. And just ahead of that deadline, President Trump said that he will not make that certification, and then this was done in the context of laying out a broader Iran strategy. He called the deal, as you know, the terrible deal, one of the, quote, worst and most one-sided agreements the United States has ever entered into. And specifically, he said that the relief is not proportional to the sanctions relief Iran is getting. What's notable is that he didn't say Iran is in breach of its nuclear commitments. In fact, people broadly agree in the United States. In Europe, the technical experts in charge of overseeing that compliance, that Iran is working within the deal, that it's in compliance with the deal. So what happens now? The president said that there are problems in this terrible deal that he wants to see addressed, and he kicked it to Congress and said, working with Congress and international allies, I want to see change on a couple of things in particular. They include dealing more aggressively with Iran's missile program, also stronger enforcement of the deal, but without specification for what that meant in his view. Not a lot of details there. And thirdly, and significantly, dealing with what's called often the sunset issue. So there are some nuclear safeguards in this agreement that sunset or that end as part of the agreement, and he, along with many others, want to see those commitments extended for a longer period in the future or indefinitely. I think many people agree on that. The question is the strategy for doing it. Now, not making this certification opens a 60-day deadline or window for Congress to reimpose the nuclear sanctions. It doesn't have to do this. It could, or it could not, or it could take some other legislative approach to this issue broadly of Iran policy. And there's a legislative proposal put forward by Senators Corker and Cotton, two Republican senators, to address issues related to Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missile activity. They have proposed draft legislation that would really set new conditions on Iran unilaterally. So this hasn't been vetted or shared with partners to the nuclear agreement. What's concerning about this approach to many people is that it's a massive vote of no confidence that the president just made in the nuclear deal. And it opens up this logistical procedure, that window for Congress to reimpose nuclear sanctions. It can do so under expedited parliamentary procedures. It's a rapid path to being able to reimpose these sanctions. So the ease of Congress doing this, at least from a legal standpoint, is very alarming to U.S. allies party to the deal and those internationally who, again, believe that this is working. So the United States now faces allies of the United States, security allies, as well as Iran, and many in the United States are upset about what's going on and concerned about the opportunity to make mischief in this scenario. Will there be strategy that moves forward that advances U.S. interests, or will the United States, if it reimposes some or all of the nuclear sanctions, thereby be seen to be in breach of the nuclear deal and not only end U.S. participation in it, but probably end the nuclear deal as it is? So that's the lay of the land briefly.
Great, thanks, Liz. So I want to transition from over there over to Colin. Colin is somebody who worked in the Obama administration during the time that the JCPOA was agreed to. You've expressed pretty clearly your view that what the president did last week was a bad idea, and that the nuclear agreement was sort of the best option that we had available. Why?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ilan. Thanks to the sponsors. Thanks for all of you for sticking around later in the day. I mean, the short answer is the deal is working to achieve the objective the deal was supposed to achieve, which is to put a lid on Iran's nuclear program. Not because it would solve every problem that we have with Iran in the region, but because it would buy us time and space to address Iran's non-nuclear activities without having to worry about the nuclear file, which is why actually the vast majority of our military and intelligence establishment and Israel's military and intelligence establishment supports the deal, even if they don't think it's perfect, because it puts Iran's nuclear program in a box for at least the next 10 to 15 years, and I would argue longer, freeing up space for us to look at Iran's non-nuclear behavior. And so one of the ironies is probably the strongest criticism that the Trump administration has made, which isn't really a criticism of the deal, but an argument that the deal doesn't solve every problem, that there are issues outside the four corners of the nuclear program, such as Iran's support for Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, their support for the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militia in Iraq, their support for Hezbollah, threats to wipe Israel off the map, and other nefarious activities that the Iranians are engaged in, that the deal doesn't cover. And that's right, it doesn't. So it's weird that the administration would now try to refocus the debate on the one part of our containment architecture towards the Iranians that's working, which is the deal, and actually threaten to blow it up in a way that would be the biggest gift to Iran one could imagine, since the only people who think that what Donald Trump is doing is a good thing is basically the president, maybe a handful of his advisors, and some folks in a handful of think tanks around town, but none of our allies do, none of the parties we negotiated the agreement with, and the Iranians will be happy to have us be isolated rather than them. So if the goal is to generate international consensus to isolate and pressure Iran outside the deal, this is the absolute worst way to go about doing it. The other issue that I'm not exactly certain how this is supposed to work is the deal isn't perfect. As Liz mentioned, there are elements of the restrictions, especially on Iran's enrichment activities, that start to fall away at years 10 and 15 of the deal, so years 2025 and 2035. Now, just to be clear, Iran is never allowed to get a nuclear weapon. Under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and this agreement, they are permanently obligated not to get a nuclear weapon, not to try to build a nuclear weapon, not to do the weapons-related work associated with getting a nuclear weapon. And the verification procedures under this deal are permanent, including the fact that under the so-called additional protocol to Iran's safeguards agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA not only gets to go to declared nuclear facilities on a 24/7 basis, but undeclared facilities where the international community might have suspicions of nuclear activity. And unless Ellie knows something, he's probably the best proliferation expert on this panel, but my understanding is there's never been a single country in history that's built a nuclear weapon while under the additional protocol. It doesn't mean that the Iranians couldn't do it, I guess, but historically it's never happened, and that is a permanent set of verification procedures. So, would it be a good thing if those restrictions that fall away at 10 and 15 are expanded? Yes, it would. But why you have to create a crisis at the 18-month point of the deal to try to produce that outcome confuses me. And the other thing is, if you believe that what Trump did, which I believe, runs a higher risk of isolating us and undermining international consensus, how do you get the pressure to produce Iran to get a better deal? We will never be able to reconstitute the pressure that we had in 2015 unless we have complete international consensus, and we don't. And the line that I've used on this is, it is completely unclear to me as a practitioner of diplomacy how you get 150% of the current deal with less than 100% of the leverage we had before the deal. It makes absolutely no sense. It's also unclear to me how a pressure-only strategy that basically tries to hang the risk of reimposing sanctions or blowing up the deal as a sort of Damocles over Iran and the Europeans and the rest of the international community, that I just don't see that as the most likely pathway to producing extensions or expansions on the current deal. I think ultimately Iran is not likely, under any set of circumstances, to capitulate to a situation in which they accept more constraints for the same or fewer benefits. You're probably going to need a more for more framework that puts things on the table like lifting the primary embargo that the United States still has in Iran, or allowing the Iranians access to the U.S. financial system to facilitate financial transactions. You know, this is a strong and proud nation, and they're engaged in all sorts of nefarious behavior. But if you believe they're about to capitulate just because Donald Trump has thrown a fit, it's not going to happen. This is a regime that during the Iran-Iraq War suffered $660 billion of economic damage and 1 million casualties, and it still took them 8 years to settle for a tie. They were not on the brink of collapse before the JCPOA. They are not on the brink of collapse now. We will not drive them to the brink of collapse and total capitulation. So the good news is the deal buys us until 2025 or 2030 to work on a steady diplomatic path to use a mix of carrots and sticks to expand the elements of the deal that are good and address those that we don't like. The bad news is this administration is incredibly impatient because the president didn't like every 90 days having to say that Barack Obama's deal was a good deal when he campaigned on it being a bad deal. And so he threw a tantrum 90 days ago and said he wasn't going to do it anymore. And so his advisors had to figure out a way to get around that problem. And in so doing, they've created a lot of uncertainty by throwing this into Congress, which could blow up the deal, or unilaterally try to renegotiate the deal in ways that, if it didn't create a quick death, could create a slow one. But other than that, it's great.
Well, Fred, I want to have you hop in here because you were skeptical of the agreement when it was agreed to 2 years ago. So I'd be interested in getting your perspective, which I'm sure is, at least in some ways, different than Colin's, but also evaluating what the Trump administration has done so far. And as we talk about it, also maybe to expand out a little bit, because I think one of your central critiques and like where you've spent a lot of time writing and working and thinking about things like Iraq and Syria and elsewhere where Iran's, behavior remains problematic, nuclear agreement, no nuclear agreement. So maybe we can also sort of start to get into that discussion as you provide your analysis.
Thanks, Ilan, and thanks to CNAS and the organizers for having me. It's always a delight to work with you and our colleagues at CNAS. I think that we need to work to try to restore some civility to this discussion. I think that's a general observation that is worth reflecting on as we talk about the current state of discourse in the United States. And I think taking the position that anyone who thinks that the deal is a bad deal is an imbecile is not conducive to restoring civility to the conversation. There's a lot to argue about whether it was a good idea to do the deal and how exactly to go forward with it. I personally don't think that the president made the right decision to decertify the deal. I do think the nuance that was offered previously about on the basis of what he decertified it is important, because he isn't asserting that Iran is in violation, which unfortunately people, including earlier today Michelle Flournoy, said. He didn't say that. He said that he doesn't think it's in America's national interest. It's not entirely clear to me that the deal is in America's national interest. I think that it probably isn't, because the problem here is that the deal, on the one hand, parses out the nuclear program from Iran's other activities, as Colin said, but not fully, because some of the relief that Iran was granted was relief that actually facilitated or will facilitate the malign activities in a very important way. And I'm thinking specifically of the termination on the ban of selling offensive weapons to Iran that will come in a few years, which was a concession that Iran insisted upon, but which actually isn't related to the nuclear program, because a ban wasn't established on the basis of the nuclear program. So the deal itself, while claiming to parse out the nuclear program and parsing out in terms of the demands we make of Iran, didn't fully parse out the concessions that we made to Iran in order to get the deal. And I think that you can well ask whether the benefits that we've gotten from the standpoint of the nuclear program, or that we will get, are worth the price that we will pay in having that international constraint on selling advanced offensive weapons to Iran go away. I think it is unfortunate that the president has chosen to conflate the issues of the nuclear deal with the larger strategy for dealing with Iran in the region that was rolled out at the same time. It is to some extent a distraction. I think it's unlikely, frankly, that Congress is going to vote to reimpose all of the sanctions or blow up the deal or so forth. And so, frankly, I think all of that overwrought rhetoric is also a little bit of a distraction. And I think that it would all be helpful for all of us, actually, to try to get away from this myopic focus on the, for or against the deal, which is not actually the way even President Trump phrased it. and focus on what's gone on with the Iranian malign activities. And we can even ask this question, what's gone on since the deal? And the answer is they've gotten enormously worse. And the Iranian military activities and military positions outside of Iran are enormously greater than they were when the deal was signed, when it was being negotiated. Of course, the deal wasn't intended to stop that. But let's also cast our minds back to the rhetoric with which the entire discussion surrounding the deal was framed, because it was presented in part as something that would lead to a larger change in Iranian attitudes. And it had to be, because if it was only about constraining Iran's ability to do research and so forth on a weapons program, but allowed Iran otherwise to seek conventional hegemony in the region, I think self-evidently it would have been a bad deal. So we have the problem that both sides are sort of making claims for purity about what the deal was and wasn't, and in fact there wasn't that degree of purity when the deal was argued for, and there isn't that degree of purity now in the discussion we're having. I think we really need to think about what matters here, and it's more than deal yes or deal no.
All right, well, and maybe, Fred, if I can ask you one follow-on, actually, which is, so Iran's malign activities, how should we be, was the Trump administration's response of, sanctions against the IRGC, but they're still doing plenty of things in the region, like negotiating with the Russians an agreement that the Israelis think enables Iran and Syria, or even some of these incidents in Kirkuk last week. Is the Trump administration really actually countering Iran's activities in the region much more aggressively, or finding new ways to do that than we were previously doing, or are we just sort of continuing the same policy?
Well, until very recently, it has been continuing largely the same policy, which was a policy of generally letting the Iranians do what they wanted, and in fact, basically having a de facto alliance with Iran and Syria. Now, we're still seeing that. And that's something that I think is much more important to be talking about, frankly, and I think Colin would agree with me, than the nuances and niceties of the decertification process. The question is, when is the Trump administration, when is the president going to realize that the policy that he is currently pursuing in Syria of de facto alliance with Iran completely vitiates the policy that he articulated and that his people in the White House articulated of constraining Iranian malign activity in the region? You can't have both of these policies at the same time. We still are trying to have both of these policies at the same time, and I think that's the discussion that we really need to be focusing on.
Well, that's a good transition to Ellie, actually. Because Ellie, what I'd like to start with is your perspective. Well, really, first, your analysis on the Israeli perspective on all this. We had Prime Minister Netanyahu come out in support of the move to not certify to Congress. At the same time, you have a lot of stories about Israeli security establishments saying they're comfortable with the deal, as Colin said. But a lot of concerns in Israel about what's going on in Syria. So maybe you can start chatting a little bit. And obviously you and I and Liz have been having a lot of conversations about this since, small plug, we're going to be putting out a report later this week. The three of us are the co-authors on that looks at a lot of these questions and what our policy should be towards Iran.
Thank you, Ilan. Thank you to the sponsors. And it's great to be here with such a wonderful audience that perseveres with us as we get into the evening. A couple of quick observations. First of all, the nuclear deal, I want to relate to something Ephraim and Levi said earlier. The nuclear deal from an Israeli perspective was indeed the right priority. Namely, at the time, the primary concern was the nuclear issue. So to be completely fair on the basis on which we assessed the deal did address the issue which was of utmost concern to Israel. So on this issue, there is no criticism of the deal, all right, at the time. What Israel thought that the deal ought to do, and that was true of every part of the Israeli government and others, was that the deal had to be a lot more comprehensive and deep in terms of the restrictions it imposes on Iran's programs. That was not achieved. That created some disagreements within the Israeli government, whether a no deal was better than a deal that gets some of it, or we're better off, continue to apply pressure on Iran that maybe will get us a better deal. The Prime Minister clearly felt that the balance had tilted in the favor of continuing to apply more pressure to get a better deal. Others had felt that given that if you actually got this is the best deal you could get at the time, you're still better off getting that deal. but making it work. My personal judgment was that, that having faced that situation of either this deal or none at all, we should go for this deal. That being said, I still would characterize the deal as having bad, good, and ugly elements. Bad in the sense that it codifies. It didn't limit the Iran nuclear program. They limited it themselves, mostly. But it codified it, and codified it for a period, which Colin has already described, with one minor caveat. The restrictions begin to phase out after 8 years, which means 6 years from today, the enrichment capability can already begin scaled up.
Make sure they understand what you mean the R&D stuff.
The R&D stuff, and so on. But in any sense, codifies the limitations, and codifies the limitations in a way that actually are profound in terms of the Iranian ability to actually build nuclear weapons. Some of the codification that Colin had talked about actually exists in the NPT, and Iran still developed nuclear weapons under the NPT, so I don't take that very seriously. That being said, I think the restrictions that the deal did put in place were significant. The bad aspect is the sunset provisions that Colin had already talked about, which begin to phase out in about 6 years, and that the other aspect, which is the most troubling to me, is that the way in which the dual-capable missiles issue is addressed is a facade and a charade. In the sense that the US that couldn't get that into the agreement put it in the Security Council resolution, which is extremely weak. And the problem is that unlike the situation we had before, but which is closely reminiscent of the current crisis we have at the DPRK, it means that within 8 years, Iran would be not weeks away from a nuclear device that could explode in the desert, but from a nuclear arsenal. That's a big, big difference, because Iran can develop and is developing dual-capable missiles that can carry nuclear warheads as we speak. And they have no other purpose for this other than nuclear delivery capability. And the other bad aspect of this is, so not only aren't you restricting those missile development, there is another missile issue, which we'll talk about in a minute, which Iran is not prevented from developing as we speak at present and so on. The deal did not transform the orientation of the Iranian nuclear program. So we should have, and the ugly aspects of the deal have been that there are lots of provisions of the deal which are innovative, untested, and some of them practically impossible to implement. So the problem we're faced is, and I'm saying this not in order to come out in a different place than Colin or Liz, should the US retain the deal for now and so on. I subscribe to the view, which somewhat differs from my prime minister, but does go along with several others, that says, given where we are, and for the reasons that Colin had advocated, that basically the US is alone and Iran is complying with the core nuclear obligations, we're better off keeping it and making the deal work on the instruments of the deal that have thus far not been implemented effectively. And the issue of utmost concern to me is that some of the verification provisions aren't working or aren't working well. And the problem is greatly compounded by the fact that the Russians get in the middle, supporting the Iranian position, and basically says you can't provide intelligence to the IAEA, you can't inspect military facilities, you cannot do weaponization verification, Iran hasn't ratified the additional protocol, and therefore the IAEA is in no position to ask Iran of doing certain things and so on. So some of the confidence that come from the verification regime, arrangements that Colin was one of the people supporting, which I agree were useful instruments, are not effectively implemented, but in theory at least could be implemented under the current arrangements of the deal, which is why I think stick with the deal, make those implemented with international support rather than wreck this international support by opting out of the deal. That being said, I think given where we are, and I don't want to get into US politics, I think we basically have 4 options of going forward. One is to try and renegotiate the deal. The administration seems to be hinting that that's the direction they want to go. That's what the National Security Advisor is basically saying. So one thing was to kick the ball in the direction of Congress, and the other one is and use congressional lever in part in order to try and renegotiate the deal. I think everyone around the panel thinks that this, I don't know, I can't speak for Fred, but I'm sure Liz and Colin would say, pretty unlikely that one can actually get a better deal now with less pressure on Iran. Option 1. Option 2 says, we can't get it, can we at least make sure that the deal doesn't really expire the way it's supposed to expire in a couple of years or phase out or whatever the provision is? How can you do it? You can do it through deterrence. You can do it through a follow-up agreement with Iran. You can do it by trying to show that Iran hasn't really earned the confidence of the international community by not transforming the nature of the program and so on, but not through wrecking the agreement and U.S. initiative right now. Okay, so that's option 2. And there's options of trying to build a regional arrangement, a sub-regional arrangement, a global arrangement that would constrain the legitimate space that Iran could exercise to scale up to a threshold state within 6 to 8 years. Can Congress play a role here? If what Congress does is impose the nuclear sanctions, which, as we all, I think Iran doesn't deserve to be punished with, and wreck the deal right away, I think Congress would not be playing a constructive role. If Congress gives kind of a bipartisan direction of the kind of things it would want to see in terms of US policy and so on in ways that do not undermine the deal, this might be constructive, helpful, or at least not destructive in the direction you go. And if the US actually emerges from this, which we don't know whether will be the case, with a bipartisan policy that transcends the current president, that would be a great development. So I would hope that regardless what the interim steps are and what the president's intention have been in terms of kicking it down the road to Congress, if we emerge from this with some bipartisan approach, we're better off.
So, and I do think one thing that I'll observe, having heard all you guys speak for a few minutes, is there's disagreements about the nuclear agreement itself and whether it was good, some bad, or ugly, but almost unanimity at least that decertifying or not certifying is probably, was probably not the wisest move last week, but now we have to see where things go forward. That's sort of like where I think there's some unity. So if that's sort of the point of unity, Liz, I want to come back to you because one of the biggest questions is going forward is sanctions and economic pressure. This was the tool that brought Iran to the table initially, along with engagement. So if we walk away from the nuclear agreement, or if we reimpose sanctions, like what happens? What kind of a sanctions regime do we have? Do you agree with Colin's point? It's going to be a lot less leverage than we previously had. It'd also be interesting to hear your assessment on how Iran's economy has reacted thus far to sanctions relief, because I heard Fred talk about how Iran's been significantly enabled by the sanctions relief to do all kinds of other problematic things in the region. And I want your assessment on that as somebody who's at Treasury and really follows the economic metrics carefully, as well as sort of your view and assessment on some of the things that have been. Sorry, Fred, you want to?
I didn't quite say that. I was not making the argument that the sanctions are what has enabled Iran to do this. I was simply making the observation that Iranian malign activity has gotten a lot worse since 2015. I'm not linking those two right now explicitly.
Okay, I will. That is an argument that's made by some others, so I apologize if I didn't get it. If I didn't. So maybe I was hopping into something I was thinking others say, but we don't have to address that. But I think we can still look at like what's happened to Iran's economy and what our leverage is and what kind of sanctions regime we might look at in the future if we reimpose.
Okay, well, you just gave me, 60 things to work on.
Yes.
I'll take steps.
So choose and ignore me too on some of this, which is always the want of a speaker.
I'll do that. Okay. So I want to pick up on a point that you ended with, Ellie, in saying it would be a great move forward if Congress could articulate a bipartisan strategy when it comes to Iran, if I am sort of paraphrasing here. In fact, that just happened in August. Congress passed a piece of legislation, not to the full extent of all Iran policy, but our Congress passed a piece of legislation in August with a piece of sanctions legislation that dealt with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It was a pretty substantial package of Iran-related sanctions. And that bill passed with almost complete support from almost every member of Congress. So that is a bipartisan articulation, and it is JCPOA compliant. So it's a bipartisan articulation of U.S. policy toward Iran. It includes additional sanctions authorities related to Iran's support for terrorism, critiquing and going after Iran's support for terrorism and its missile activities. There's a number, IRGC in particular, a number of other things in there. So that can and should be a starting point. And I think in the first panel, Michelle pointed out that in fact the administration hasn't done anything at all to implement that yet. So that would be a good step forward to actually go ahead and implement that. But to your question, Ilan, about what happens in a reimposition of sanctions scenario? What would that mean for Iran's economy, reversing positive changes that it has experienced since receiving relief as part of the Iran nuclear deal? So I agree with Fred's comments that, and actually several people have said this, it seems unlikely that Congress will fully reimpose nuclear sanctions for a couple of reasons. One, Congress doesn't want to own that. That's really messy. And I think actually there's not overwhelming, immediate, bipartisan, mainstream interest in doing that now. Whether you thought the deal was good, bad, or ugly, there's not an interest in moving forward with that. And that piece of legislation I mentioned, the Republican piece of legislation that would address the nuclear deal and Iran policy broadly, it would not qualify as sanctions that could move under that rapid parliamentary procedure to reimpose sanctions, which is an indication that it does not have immediate, urgent, mainstream bipartisan support. So the principle to keep in mind when it comes to sanctions is that multilateralism is key for effectiveness. And the way that the United States and allies internationally built this incredible economic pressure, as well as political isolation of Iran leading up to the agreement of the nuclear agreement, the agreement to the JCPOA, was in part of a multilateral coalition where a number of significantly major financial jurisdictions, the United States, the EU, and some others critical to Iran's economy, oil purchasers in particular, agreed together and worked together to isolate Iran and shut it off. That overwhelming pressure created an awful lot of leverage. If the United States decides to go it alone on sanctions, and it does surely seem that that will be the path forward, given that US allies and many of those important financial jurisdictions and important Iran oil purchasers don't agree with the United States that we should throw out the deal and in search of a better deal, or with that argument, and they look unlikely to go along with the United States in reimposing a whole host of sanctions. We're not looking at a scenario of multilateral sanctions pressure, which means that it's a very leaky and uneven picture that equals relatively ineffective sanctions. And what that then means is that the United States has pretty limited economic leverage to use in pressuring Iran to try and move towards political concessions on the part of Iran. That doesn't seem like a great outcome. That's a worse place to negotiate from than the position of strength that brought the United States and allies and Iran to this negotiating table together. A note on Iran's economy. So it did have good GDP growth last year and coming out of the nuclear deal. But when you look at that, closely, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. One is that that's coming off a pretty weak base, and weak given all of the factors that it has going in its favor. It has a well-educated population. It has a young workforce. It has a relatively internationally oriented workforce, raw resources, natural resources and economy. It's well situated internationally, supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really underperforming. I mean, that's an understatement. It is significantly underperforming, even given the availability that it has to engage in international trade. And also, almost all of its GDP growth is based on energy sales. That's not energy investment to expand its production capacity in oil and natural gas. That's sale of oil. And if you think about a scenario where the United States decides to use its considerable economic clout to reimpose sanctions, if it is not joined by Iran's major oil buyers, and it won't be, then they will continue to buy oil, and maybe they will pull back initially or start to turn towards middlemen in order to purchase that oil. But that means that Iran continues to generate revenue, and the United States has that much less leverage.
So Fred, I think you wanted to get in here in response, and afterwards, Colin, I wanted to get your take on a whole bunch of the things that have been said thus far.
Thanks. Look, we need to be clear about a couple of things. The Obama administration, rightly or wrongly, cashed in the international sanctions regime, which was mostly based on UN Security Council resolutions that were not time limited or sunsetted. And it chose to cash those in exchange for a time limited deal. The reason why we don't have those multilateral sanctions and won't have them again is because it cashed them in to get the deal. I'm not going to make a judgment now about whether that was a good idea or not, but we need to keep that in mind. So that's gone regardless of what President Trump does. Does anyone in this room seriously think that Vladimir Putin, in the world as it is today, is going to vote to reimpose draconian sanctions on Iran because we or the IAEA or somebody or his own intelligence agency asserts that Iran is violating the deal in some way? Because that, to me, is a fundamental misreading of a major geostrategic inflection that has occurred over the last few years that had nothing to do with the deal, but had to do with the creation of a Russo-Iranian military alliance and coalition in the region on which Russia is now completely dependent for its continued position in the region. So I can't imagine a scenario. First of all, there's no level playing field here. This isn't about going to the IAEA or going to the Russians with the IAEA and saying, look, the Iranians are cheating, surely you must agree. This is not the game Putin is playing. I can't imagine a scenario where we actually get anything like a return to the status quo ante of this deal with international sanctions anyway. But neither are we quite as helpless as is sometimes portrayed. Look, the United States, and again, I'm not advocating a particular position, but I just think we need to have this in the discussion. We are in a position to go to every single geostrategic major power in the world and say, you have a choice. You can trade with an economy that is $480 billion large, or you can trade with an economy that's $15 trillion large. You can do one or the other, pick. I would submit that that is actually a fair amount of leverage if we chose to use it. Now, again, that might or might not be the right thing to do, but I just think that there's a little bit of exaggeration on both sides of this discussion about how impossible, how good it would be if we could re-establish something that we're never going to be re-established, and how hopeless it is for us in the situation that we're in today.
Colin, I don't know if you wanted to hop in on a whole bunch of different things that have been said, so I could just sort of tee that up and let you go.
Yeah, I'm happy to. First of all, I think actually probably agree more than disagree with a lot of, to include Fred's plea for civility. So but just to be clear, I don't think anybody up here is an imbecile. I was direct to the degree that I have well, Ilan maybe, but less so maybe for the president, but I'll put that to a side. He brings out the best and the worst in me. A couple of things I think worth thinking about. I do think it's worth thinking about the relationship between the deal and Iran's regional behavior. Because I think Fred is at least partially right that Iran's troubling behavior, which predated the deal, occurred during the negotiations of the deal, and perhaps has gotten worse after the deal. I think how you would measure that is something that's actually worth talking about. But whether it's connected to the deal or not is an interesting question. So the conventional weapons ban that goes away at year 5, just as a technical matter, that conventional arms embargo was negotiated as part of UN Security Council Resolution 1929 that was passed in June of 2010 and tied to the nuclear question. So as a matter, it's not about the nuclear issue, but the only reason we got the arms embargo was as a punitive measure in the context of the nuclear file. The reason why that's relevant is the Russians and the Chinese, but especially the Russians, wanted that to go away on day 1. Of course, the Iranians did as well, and we fought and clawed and did our best to keep for 5 years. So maybe we could have been even better negotiators and got a couple of extra years, but the notion that that conventional arms embargo in the absence of a nuclear justification for putting it in place would have been sustained, I think, at least didn't represent the reality that we were seeing in 2014 and 2015 during these negotiations. A couple of other things, and I know this wasn't Fred's argument, but it is a widely held notion that, and the president said himself, that the deal flooded Iran with cash and therefore has enabled all their nefarious actions in the region. I think that needs to be interrogated pretty carefully. So, first of all, the president likes to say that that Iran got $150 billion of U.S. taxpayer money. Actually, they got all the money they got was their money, and they didn't get anywhere near $150 billion. But other than that, he's totally right. They actually got probably closer to $50 billion, which is what our Treasury Department predicted they would get from unfrozen assets. And as our intelligence community predicted, they have spent the vast majority of that on their domestic issues, not their military. Now, they have increased their military budget by, I think, about 12%. Don't quote me on that statistic. I believe last year's military budget for Iran was $15 billion. To put that in perspective, that's about 40% of Israel's defense budget. It's about 1/5 of Saudi Arabia's defense budget and about 1/10 of the GCC's combined defense budget. So Iran is not a military juggernaut. The problem is that Iran doesn't need a lot of money to make a lot of trouble. And so going after their money is actually not necessarily the most effective way because the total Quds Force budget is like $5 billion a year. It's just not a lot of money. That's not how you're going to solve the problem. Sanctions are part of it, and I'm all for sanctioning and targeted sanctions against entities that engage in terrorism and support militancy and support the ballistic missile program and everything else. But you're also going to need intelligence sharing, interdictions, ballistic missile defense. You have to build up the capacity of our partners to include the Iraqis who actually want our help and are engaging countries like Saudi Arabia because they know they need to counterbalance Iran in the region. It means continuing to assist the Gulf states and Israel and other countries as we have before. But the real reason that Iran has made more trouble since the deal is that the region is in flames. And Iran does a much better job of capitalizing on chaos than Iran's adversaries do in either exploiting the situation or in building things. It's easier to destroy than to build. Iran doesn't want to build, actually. They just want parallel institutions with it. They don't build states. They build parallel institutions. So they don't build the Lebanese state. They build Hezbollah. They don't build a Palestinian authority. They help Hamas. They don't build the Iraqi state. They build the Popular Mobilization Forces tied to the IRGC. And they exploit chaos and work with whoever kills whoever they don't like. And it's cheap and it's relatively easy. And so that requires a holistic strategy focused on trying to wind these conflicts down. And one of the things that that there just is none of in the Trump administration is, raise your hand if you have any clue as to what their diplomatic way ahead is in Syria, Yemen, or Iraq. Does anybody? Because I don't. And if you don't know what their way ahead is in those places, that means they probably don't either, or at least they're not articulating it. And I don't know how you deal with Iran's nefarious influence without diplomacy. So, for example, the biggest boon for Iran in the last couple of weeks has been the failure of American diplomacy to prevent the upturn in tensions between Arabs and Kurds inside of Iraq, which has provided Iran huge opportunities to make mischief and empowered Qasem Soleimani to be going all around and cutting deals, driving wedges within the Kurds and everything else. That's a diplomatic solution. It's not a kinetic solution. And this is the last point I would make. And I'm really, this is going to come off as snarky, and it maybe is that a little bit. But, you know, our commander-in-chief fancies himself the master of the art of the deal, right? That's his brand. I'm not convinced. But I'll tell you this. If you want a better Iran deal, you need actual human beings to negotiate it. There are no human beings in this government. We have a cabinet, although some empty seats now. We have very few deputies, almost no undersecretaries, no relevant assistant secretaries, no relevant deputy assistant secretaries. You need actual people. Presidents and secretaries of state don't negotiate deals. They come in at the end and get you over the hump or get you over the goal line. We are running a giant experiment in not having a government. And that is not a pathway to a better deal. And that's not a partisan argument. It's embarrassing. We're a superpower that's hobbling ourselves because we can't staff a government. And that seems like a little thing, but it's a huge thing. The last point I want to make is just on Ellie's point about ballistic missiles. And I agree with much of what Ellie said, but disagree on the ballistic missile point in the sense that even if Iran had zero nuclear ambitions, they'd build ballistic missiles. Why? Because for the same reason that Hezbollah has rockets and missiles, it has a retaliatory capability. The Israelis have long-range refueling capabilities that they can strike Iran. The Saudis have long-range aircraft, and they have their own ballistic missiles. Iran uses its ballistic missiles for conventional deterrence and retaliation. I'm not trying to be Iran's lawyer. I'm just saying you're not going to talk them out of that, even without a nuclear issue. And so I also don't think you're going to solve the ballistic missile issue unless you start to frame it as a regional arms control issue, and maybe frame ballistic missile restrictions that apply beyond the Iranians to other countries in the region. So I just put that out there not to excuse their behavior, but to help us try to understand it.
Ellie, you look like you want to comment on something.
Yeah, I
so
want to
I'll just-
comment on the last point and then tie it with some of the comments that the others have made. First of all, I think Colin conflates dual-capable ballistic missiles with the others. I was talking about the dual-capable. To design these kind of missiles, you don't do if you don't have nuclear ambitions, period. The fact that Iran would continue to develop cruise missiles, ballistic missiles of a different type, UAVs or whatever, onboard, sort of unmanned air vehicles and so on, that's a different story altogether. It's very worrisome in a different context. You do not develop missiles that can carry such huge payloads over such long distances and with certain diameters and so on if you don't want to have a missile delivery capability to carry nuclear weapons. That's the issue. That's the Security Council resolution. That's, I think, where you traded off a big, big issue. And the administration hasn't been that effective in dealing with this issue. That issue aside, I think that there is another aspect to where we are at the moment. I think Israel and Iran are sliding towards a war in Syria and Lebanon. I think it's a pretty worrisome prospect, and it's a pretty worrisome prospect that is not far in the future. I think the question in front of us is whether Israel, the United States, and several others and so on can do something about the threat that Iran presently presents in Syria and in Lebanon. Whether it's through arms supplies, for the first time through extensive physical presence of Iranian forces in there and so on. And the question is whether the strategy to effectively deal with that scenario with other US allies and so on requires breaking up the nuclear deal, or doesn't require breaking up the nuclear deal, actually keeping it and focusing our minds on the non-nuclear aspects. So where I come at it is saying, yes, I would have loved to see a better nuclear deal. I don't think it's in the cards in the immediate future. I think we need to focus our minds on the current obligations not expiring. And I want all of the attentions and the resources now to focus on preventing Iran from thinking they have an opportunity to create a second front against Israel in Syria and Lebanon of the nature that they're trying to do, together with, with relocation of population and building this bridgehead and so on. Some of it was discussed in the earlier panel and so on. This is the scenario. And I would hope that what emerges out of Congress or out of the current, whatever the president's intention may have been, would be a policy that follows what we are trying to advocate in the report that will come out later in the week, that basically says, keep the current nuclear deal in place. Try to make some of its provisions that haven't been effectively implemented better focused on their implementation. Start working on the sunset provisions and whatever to prevent Iran from scaling it up. Focus everything now on the regional behavior. And of the regional behavior, or there are lots of nefarious activities Iran is in the midst of, I think we can get some support from others to actually try and deal with the Syria and Lebanon first. Iraq in second place. Yemen shouldn't be a high priority for us and so on. I think that's the most urgent thing. And this is not a remote prospect that we're looking at, but rather short-term one.
Well, that's a good summary also and plug for our report, which I'm always happy to do during our panels. What I want to do now is open it up for questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions. And if folks want to get in line, and I think what we'll do is we're going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time because we don't have a lot of time. And so why don't we start, we'll do 2 questions here, one over here and one on the other side.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
First of all, what is Iran's long-term goal? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is the government of Iran dealing with a restive population that could rise up in any way? Because my impression is that there's a significant portion of their population that's educated, pro-Western, pro-American, pro-democracy, and of course there's a significant population that is pro-theocracy. I'll leave it at that. I'd like to hear from all of you.
We'll take one other question here because we have a member of Congress asking the question, so I'll add an additional one on this side before going to the other one, Congressman Nadler.
Thank you. I just want to ask Fred Kagan a specific question. I agree with much of what was said here, but one specific thing. You make the argument that you could get a better deal by saying to other countries, you can either deal with the United States economically or you can deal with Iran economically. We have a much better economy, they'll choose us, and thus you can force them to impose sanctions or whatever. That was Prime Minister Netanyahu's argument 2 years ago. It was other people's argument. It made no sense to me, and I'll ask you, because in effect what you're saying is we should say to England, to France, to Germany, to all our trading partners, if you don't do what we want, if you deal with Iran, and we don't want you to deal with Iran, we will prohibit you from dealing with us and our banks. We will prohibit you from paying for our exports. We will shut down our economy. We will prohibit you from dealing with our banks because you're dealing with Iranian banks, and therefore you cannot pay for our exports. You cannot pay for our products. In effect, it's a threat that is unbelievable and undoable, because it says we'll talk about spiting your nose about your face. You're saying we'll destroy our economy.
So we're going to do one more question over here, and then we're going to give people an opportunity to respond.
Hi there. I'm a Jewish Iranian expat myself, and what I always like to remind everybody is that Iran's human rights records is a complete disaster, and daily they jail, kill their opposition in order to maintain power. Eli, this question is for you. What are your thoughts on regime change? I think a lot of the criticism of the JCPOA was that it actually cemented the regime's hold on the country, but do you think there's potential now with the new U.S. administration to release the people of Iran from the hell they live in?
So I think we have a question. We had the question from Congressman Adler that I think Fred can respond. You want to take the other two questions? You know what? Sure. I'm gonna have a hard time remember everything, but I'll do my best. But let's do two more questions.
This is actually a question that came to me from an Iranian friend who lives here in the States. He said, why should Israel have a nuclear weapon and Iran doesn't have nuclear weapon? And if Israel is allowed to have nuclear weapon, why are we preventing Iran from having them to solve? Anyhow, so that's their question, and I didn't know how to answer it.
Right.
That's
It's a
all.
question from them, and you need to know how to respond. And we'll have one last.
Eli, my question relates to your comment about Iran's behavior in both Lebanon and Syria and the threat it poses to Israel, both short and long term. What specific steps could be taken to impact Iran's behavior both in Syria and Lebanon and to lessen the threat that it poses to Israel?
All right, so to summarize, and let's see if I got it all. Fred, for you, the question about whether or not this threat is credible to actually cut other countries off from the international community. And Liz, you might have some things to say about too. I imagine. Questions about Iran's long-term strategy. Questions about, I think a couple of questions about the stability of the regime and the possibility of regime change. And then a specific question about what we can do specifically in Lebanon and Syria to try to counter the threat posed by Iran. So why don't we give every one of the panelists one last opportunity to speak. I'll start with Fred and just go down the line, and then I think we'll close.
So Congressman, this is not a new idea, and it is in fact already law. That's what secondary sanctions are. It's not a question of banning Britain. It's a question of telling companies that do business with entities in Iran that are subject to secondary sanctions that if those companies do business with those entities, they will be banned from engaging in commerce with the United States. That's already law. And that law was just passed in Congress again, extending sanctions to the IRGC. Those are secondary sanctions imposing legislation. So we're already there. And it's company by company. It's not country by country. And I'm certainly not advocating telling Britain that Britain can't trade with us. And I think that we're already seeing the effects of this. And this goes to the point about, what benefit have the Iranians gotten? Well, a lot less than they had hoped, in part because a lot of companies around the world would be investing, remain extremely nervous that we might do exactly what we have in fact done, which is to change our minds about how we feel about the deal and start imposing additional sanctions and so forth. And you've seen a tremendous amount of hesitation on the part of companies precisely for this reason. So I think that the specific threat is quite a credible threat, and I think we're seeing that play out. And I don't think that we're talking about proposing to commit suicide. If I could just talk to the issue of the larger Iranian objectives, the Iranian objective is to reestablish what they believe is rightfully Persian hegemony over the entire Middle East and recreate the Sassanid Empire, whatever, or Parthian Empire, whatever empire they happen to choose at the moment, only that happens to be Shia this time. That's the objective. It also includes expelling the United States and its allies from the region entirely and establishing Iran as the leader of the Muslim world, not just the Shia world. And of course, as I'm sure most of you know, it's not the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, because the regime sees itself as the vanguard of all Muslims and not just Shia, which is, of course, hasn't worked out for them terribly well, but that is, in fact, the objective. It is a regime that is built on an ideology that has three pillars. One is anti-Zionism, one is anti-colonialism, which has been turned into anti-Americanism, and the third is the peculiar weirdness of the odd theo-ideology that Khomeini invented, which didn't exist before he invented it. It's important to keep in mind, and bring Persian nationalism into that. It's important to keep that in mind when we talk about the stability of the regime and how restless it actually is, or the population actually is, because the way this regime plays its cards, you don't have to buy into all three or all four of those according to the regime in order to support the regime. And so what you will find is that Persian nationalists who don't especially like the theo-ideology nevertheless will support the regime when they see the regime doing what they want done on behalf of Persians. And all of these different things are ways of stabilizing the regime. And lastly, this regime is the most successful dictatorship that I have ever seen in history at masking the degree to which it is a dictatorship to its own people and providing relief valves for this kind of unrest in the form of real elections that just happen not to be for the position that actually makes all of the decisions, but that look as if they might affect that, even though they don't. And as a result of that, I think we need to be very wary about the notion that there's some simmering discontent in Iran that if we just lit a match, the whole place would go up. I actually think this regime is pretty solidly in place for the foreseeable future, which is something that should concern us.
Colin?
So on this last point, look, I think the Iranians want to be the dominant actor in the Middle East. If you look at their population and their geography and their civilizational history, they believe that they are destined to be that. I do think that there's a debate among Iranian elites about what the most effective strategy is to get there. I think hardliners and principalists seem to think of Islamic revolution and resistance as the pathway, whereas I think folks we might consider to be pragmatists or moderates believe that if Iran is integrated into the international community and treated as a more normal country, the sheer weight and gravitational pull of the Islamic Republic will just leave them the last person standing, which is frankly something that scares the hell out of countries like the Saudis, who also look at the same demographics and everything else and don't think they stack up very well. So anyway, there's that. Will the Iranian population revolt? I think that Rouhani's election in 2013 ended the possibility of a revolt. The regime's legitimacy probably reached a post-revolution low after the fraudulent 2009 elections. I think Rouhani's election, for some of the reasons that Fred pointed out, re-legitimized the system and provided enough of a safety valve. I think even had we kept sanctions in place, the regime would not have collapsed, unlike what Trump said the other day. There's certainly nobody in the intelligence community thought they were on the brink of regime change. I think that the path we're pursuing now, which basically puts us as the isolated party and allows Iran to play the victim. It's also not particularly helpful for the Iranian people if one is interested in the Iranian people, as I think we all should be. The last is, I think it's an open question about whether in the medium to long term the revolution ages out. I do think that from a generational perspective, it's hard to see this regime existing in its current form 20 or 30 years from now as the cadre of leaders that grew up during the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war die. Now, will it be a kumbaya perfect place? I don't know, but it probably will be different from what it is currently now. Congressman Adler, one point I would add to yours. So in part I agree with Fred, like just the uncertainty around decertification and Trump's support for the Iran deal has already chilled some investment and some banking relations. But it is the case that there will be a lot of banks and firms that continue to do business with Iran, even if we reimposed a lot of the sanctions. And it's important to keep in mind Liz's point on multilateralism, that during the 1990s, We had secondary sanctions on energy investments inside Iran, and the Europeans ignored us and told their companies to ignore us and passed blocking legislation to prevent their companies from complying and threatened to take us to the WTO and retaliate. That is, they threatened to start a trade war if we started sanctioning their companies. And I don't even think that Trump's economic nationalism goes so far as to being willing to start a trade war with China, Japan, South Korea, Turkey, and the European Union all at the same time to enforce Iran sanctions across the board. Maybe he would. It would be a catastrophically bad idea. The last point quickly, why on this point that's relevant, how do you answer your friend why Iran can't have nuclear weapons if the United States does? Because Iran signed the NPT.
If Israel does.
Well, Israel didn't sign the NPT, and they developed their nuclear weapons allegedly before the NPT. Well, I guess they developed them right after the NPT. Anyway, it's a good. I'll let Ellie talk about that question.
Ellie's not going to be able to comment on that one.
All right. On Syria and Lebanon, the only things I will say is, in Lebanon, we have to use the strategy of trying to continue to bolster institutions that aren't Hezbollah, while going after Hezbollah to the degree we can through sanctions, interdictions, intelligence, et cetera. In Syria, I don't think we should put a lot of boots on the ground, but I do think we are approaching a place in which various competing outside actors, to include us, will control zones of influence inside of Syria, from which we have lily pads to compete with Iran. In northern and central Syria, a lot will depend on how the conflict around Deir ez-Zor and the Iraqi border shakes out, and then how this de-escalation zone in the southwestern portion of the country that abuts the Golan is actually enforced and expanded upon. And that's where I think Ellie's point about warning about the Israelis getting into the soup is an important one to watch.
Ellie, and I'll remind both.
Yeah, given the time constraints, let me take two issues and they deal with both very quickly. One, on the Syria-Lebanon issue, I would say the following. I think that the Iranian sort of approach is mostly opportunistic and risk-averse. Thus far, Israel has been doing low-profile interdiction efforts to try and deal with the most worrisome aspects. That was before Iran's physical presence on the ground was the biggest issue and was more against arms transfers. I think Israel will have to do more. I think Israel is trying to do more, both diplomatically and militarily, trying to get the Russians both to give Israel a free hand and to rein in the Syrians and the Iranians to some extent, with some success. I think that's where the U.S. component is basically missing at the moment. So that's where I think we call for some direct intervention. But my sense is that the Iranians won't test you if they actually think that the resolve is there and so on. And I think that the last component of that strategy is there is a big part of the Iranian population that is not interested in Iranian adventurism abroad for Syria. We haven't played that card enough, and I think we need to play that card enough. I think there is sort of not because they love us, because they think the priorities of Iran are elsewhere, and Iran suffers from acute problems. Liz has begun to describe some of them. On the Israeli nuclear issue, I would say only four things. Number one, Israel has had for all of these years and maintains a policy that Israel has a nuclear option rather than a nuclear weapon. And I don't have the time to actually explain to you the difference, but it's a huge difference. Israel does not want to become a nuclear power. Israel has not violated the NPT, unlike Iran. Israel has been facing a potential existential threat, which under the current circumstances does not exist, but the prospect of that recurs. And finally, Israel, unlike Iran, hasn't threatened to destroy any other country. So I think that has created essentially a spirit of sympathy and understanding for the Israeli posture, so long as Israel behaves in a responsible way in the nuclear domain, which it does.
I think that last point in particular is a good one. Liz, I'm going to give you the final word here on anything you'd like to weigh in on. From
the
this
final
discussion.
word in less than 1 minute. I'll just, mindful of the time. I would associate myself with the comments that Colin made about playing chicken on secondary sanctions. So, Congressman, to your point. And just to break that down a little bit more, I agree that it would be, ideally with secondary sanctions, you're in a position where the threat is deterrent enough and you hope to never have to test that theory and play chicken with, literally we're talking about the biggest European and Asian energy companies and refineries and power producers and their banks. Bear in mind that some of them, including Total and and Shell, the majority of their shareholders, the publicly traded companies, exist in the United States. I bet all of our retirement, the majority of us have retirement savings exposed to the funds, rather to the companies that would be targeted by this. The largest banks in the world, literally the largest banks in the world, Chinese banks, we're talking about going after them. They're larger than our banks domestically. So it would shred our credibility with our allies. It would be expensive. It would be a huge trade headache. And perhaps more importantly to me as a sanctions practitioner, what you do in that scenario is dare, and for example, China and Chinese banks to go toe-to-toe with the United States economically and their exposure to US sanctions. And what they will do is do what they want anyway and create institutions and banks that are completely separate from the US financial system and therefore are not touched by US sanctions, which is a reality that has many, many more damaging effects for our economy and our national interests than merely the execution of our sanctions leverage.
So with that, I would like to have everybody thank our distinguished panel. Thank you, guys.